The story of Pharaoh and the 10 plagues of Egypt is one of the most dramatic showdowns in ancient literature. But beneath the frogs, the darkness, and the splitting of the sea lies a deeply unsettling theological puzzle that has kept scholars up at night for thousands of years. If you read the book of Exodus closely, the narrative takes a bizarre turn. Early on, we read that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but later, the script flips, and the text explicitly states that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This raises a massive question about free will. If God actively locked Pharaoh into a state of stubbornness, how could he fairly punish him and the Egyptian people? Was Pharaoh a genuine villain choosing cruelty, or was he just a helpless puppet in a cosmic drama? Let's break this down across 6 distinct phases of the narrative to see what is actually going on beneath the surface text. When Moses first walks into the royal court and demands, "Let my people go," Pharaoh's response isn't just a political no, it is an act of supreme arrogance. He looks at Moses and essentially says, "Who is this God? I don't know him and I'm definitely not listening to him." In ancient Egypt, Pharaoh wasn't considered just a king. He was viewed as a living god on earth, the embodiment of Horus in life and Osiris in death. His word was absolute cosmic law. For the first 5 plagues, blood, frogs, gnats, flies, and livestock disease, the biblical text repeatedly notes that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, or that his heart became hard. At this stage in the story, Pharaoh is operating with complete, uninhibited free will. He is looking at the suffering of his subjects and actively choosing his own pride and economic empire over human decency. God didn't force him to be cruel. Pharaoh was doing a perfectly fine job of choosing cruelty all on his own. To understand what happens next, we have to look at the ancient Hebrew language, which uses 3 entirely different words that English translations lazily lump together as hardened. Each word paints a vastly different psychological picture. Kashar. This means to make something stiff, stubborn, or severe. It's like a neck that refuses to bend. Kabid. This means to make something heavy. In ancient Egyptian theology, when you died, your heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and justice. If your heart was heavy with sin, you were condemned. By saying Pharaoh's heart was heavy, the Hebrew text is subtly mocking Egyptian religion. Pharaoh thought he was a god, but his heavy heart proved he was spiritually failing. Chazak. This means to strengthen, fortify, or make courageous. When the text later transitions to God hardening Pharaoh's heart, it almost always uses Shazak. God wasn't injecting evil into Pharaoh's mind. He was strengthening Pharaoh's resolve. Why would God do that? Because the plagues were becoming so terrifying that Pharaoh's natural human survival instinct would have forced him to give up, even if his mind hadn't actually changed. By strengthening his heart, God leveled the playing field, allowing Pharaoh to make a choice based on his actual desires rather than pure, unadulterated terror. The shift happens during the 6th plague, boils. For the first time, the text changes its phrasing, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. This is a profound theological concept known as judicial blinding or judicial hardening. It is the idea that if a person chooses to reject truth, justice, and mercy long enough, God will eventually validate their choice. He essentially says, "You want a hard heart? Fine, have it." Think of it like a physical muscle. If you spent years forcing yourself to look away from suffering, eventually your capacity for empathy would atrophy completely. Pharaoh spent decades enslaving the Hebrews and drowning their newborn sons. He had spent his entire life building a conscience of stone. By the time the 6th plague rolled around, God simply sealed Pharaoh in the very state of mind he had spent a lifetime creating. This brings us to the core of the paradox. How do God's grand plans coexist with our personal choices? The text indicates that God knew exactly what Pharaoh would do before Moses ever set foot in Egypt. In fact, God told Moses at the burning bush that he would harden Pharaoh's heart so that his signs and wonders could be displayed across the earth. This sounds incredibly unfair to modern ears. But from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, human agency and divine sovereignty were two sides of the same coin. The writers of Exodus didn't see a contradiction between saying Pharaoh chose evil and God caused this to happen. To them, God is the ultimate author of history. If a tyrant acts out of wicked pride, God doesn't violently stop them right away. Instead, he weaves that person's free choices into his larger narrative of rescue and redemption. Pharaoh wanted to display his own glory and power through cruelty. God essentially hijacked Pharaoh's stubbornness to display his own power through liberation. A classic theological analogy used to explain this dynamic involves the sun. The exact same sun shines down on two different materials, clay and wax. When the sun beats down on the wax melts, becomes soft, and yields to the heat. But when that exact same sun shines on the clay bakes, cracks, and turns to stone. The sun didn't change its nature, nor did it treat the two materials differently. The difference in outcome lies entirely within the composition of the materials themselves. In the Exodus story, God's presence and demands are the sun. A humble leader would have looked at the plagues, melted like wax, and repented. But because Pharaoh's heart was made of the selfish clay of absolute power and arrogance, the exact same manifestation of God's presence only served to bake him into an even harder, more stubborn posture. Pharaoh was hardened by God's light, but only because of what Pharaoh had already chosen to be. Ultimately, the story of Pharaoh isn't a text designed to prove that we are all helpless robots controlled by a cosmic programmer. It's actually a stark warning about the terrifying power of human habit and ego. Pharaoh wasn't an innocent bystander forced to be a monster. He chose evil over and over again when he had the freedom to do otherwise. By the time God stepped in to lock that choice into place, Pharaoh had already crossed a spiritual point of no return. The narrative reveals a sobering truth about human nature. Our choices shape who we become. Every time we choose pride over humility or selfishness over justice, we harden our own hearts just a little bit. The tragedy of Pharaoh is that he built his own mental prison, stone by stone, until the door finally locked from the inside, leaving him to face the devastating consequences of a reality he insisted on creating.